There is a peculiar agony in being deemed insufficient, a wound that cuts far deeper than any blade, for it strikes not at the flesh, but at the very essence of one's worth, and it was this particular torment that Lady Eleanor Ashworth came to know with devastating intimacy in the spring of her 22nd year. She had been, by all accounts that mattered to the discerning eyes of society, a young woman of considerable merit, possessed of a keen intelligence that sparkled in conversation, a dignity that never wavered even in the most trying of circumstances, and a beauty that, while perhaps not the kind to inspire sonnets from besotted poets, held a quiet loveliness in the gentle curve of her cheek, the thoughtful depth of her grey eyes, and the graceful way she carried herself through drawing-rooms and ballrooms alike. Her hair, the colour of chestnuts touched by autumn light, framed features that spoke of both gentleness and an inner strength that had been tested time and again by the precarious nature of her family's circumstances. For the Ashworths, though bearing a title that stretched back generations, had fallen upon times so desperate that the very walls of their modest country estate seemed to whisper of debts unpaid and futures uncertain. Her father, the Viscount, was a good man but an unfortunate one, having inherited not wealth but the accumulated misfortunes of ancestors who had gambled poorly, invested unwisely, and trusted too freely in those who did not deserve such faith. It was into this landscape of genteel poverty and quiet desperation that Lord Philip Mercer had arrived like a beam of unexpected sunlight, a barren son with a handsome face, a silver tongue, and prospects that seemed, at the time, both promising and secure. He had courted Eleanor with all the practiced charm of a man who knew precisely how to make a woman feel cherished, showering her with compliments that made her cheeks flush and promises that made her heart dare to hope. Their engagement had been announced with all proper ceremony, and for a brief, glittering moment, Eleanor had allowed herself to believe that perhaps fortune had finally decided to smile upon her, that love and security might walk hand in hand into her future. She had spent those months of betrothal imagining the life they would build together, the children they might raise, the quiet contentment of a home filled with warmth and partnership, never suspecting that the foundation upon which she was constructing these dreams was nothing more than sand, ready to shift and crumble beneath her feet at the first sign of a more advantageous tide. The ball at Hartwell House had been, by all measures of society's exacting standards, the event of the season, with candles blazing in crystal chandeliers that cast their golden light upon silk gowns and gleaming jewels, upon faces flushed with champagne and the heady excitement of gossip yet to be born, and it was into this glittering arena of social performance that Eleanor had entered on Lord Philip's arm, her heart full of quiet contentment, entirely unaware that she was walking toward the most devastating moment of her existence. She had worn her best gown that evening, a pale blue muslin that her mother had painstakingly embellished with ribbon salvaged from better days, and though it could not compare to the elaborate confections adorning wealthier ladies, Eleanor had felt almost pretty, almost worthy of the handsome man beside her, whose charm had seemed, until that very night, reserved entirely for her. The music had been playing, a lilting waltz that swirled around the dancers like perfumed air, when Philip had guided her not toward the dance floor, but toward the center of the room, where curious eyes could easily gather, and something in the set of his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained between their bodies, had sent the first cold tendril of dread curling through her stomach. "I find I must speak plainly, Lady Eleanor," he had announced, his voice carrying with theatrical precision across the suddenly quieting room, for it would be unkind to continue a pretense that can lead nowhere of benefit to either party. She had stood frozen, her gloved fingers still resting on his arm, as he spoke of reconsidered circumstances, of opportunities that a man of ambition could not ignore, of Miss Arabella Crawford and her £40,000 that made Eleanor's meagre dowry appear as insignificant as dust upon a mantelpiece. "Surely you must understand," he had continued with a smile that seemed almost pitying, "that a gentleman cannot shackle himself to faded prospects and desperate circumstances when fortune offers a more sensible path." The whispers had begun immediately, a rising tide of scandalized delight that washed over Eleanor, even as she commanded her face to remain composed, her spine to remain straight, her eyes to betray nothing of the way. Her heart was shattering into pieces so small she wondered if she would ever find them all. She had curtsied, for what else could she do, and murmured something about wishing him well that she did not mean and could not recall moments later. And then she had walked, not fled, never fled, for she would not give them that satisfaction through the parting crowd toward the entrance, feeling their stares like brands upon her skin. The carriage ride home had passed in silence, broken only by her mother's quiet weeping, and in the days that followed, Eleanor had retreated from society entirely, unable to bear the pitying glances that cut as deeply as the cruel ones. The whispered speculations about what deficiency in her character or person had driven a man to such public rejection, until the walls of her family's crumbling estate became both prison and sanctuary, and she resigned herself to a future as colorless and empty as the ashes of her foolish, girlish hopes. The letter arrived on a grey morning in early autumn, when the trees had begun their slow surrender to the coming cold, and Eleanor had settled into a quiet acceptance of her diminished circumstances, its heavy cream paper and the imposing seal pressed into burgundy wax, marking it as correspondence from a world she had believed herself forever exiled from. And when she broke that seal with trembling fingers, she found within words that made no sense at all a summons, formal yet unmistakably commanding, requesting her presence at Blackwood Manor at her earliest convenience to discuss a matter of mutual benefit, signed with the bold, uncompromising hand of Marcus Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth. She read the letter 3 times, certain she had misunderstood, for what possible business could a duke and such a duke as this one have with the disgraced daughter of an impoverished viscount, whose name had become synonymous with scandal and foolish romantic hopes? The Duke of Ashworth was a figure more of legend than reality in the circles Eleanor had once inhabited, spoken of in hushed tones and knowing glances as a man who had turned his back on society with a contempt that bordered on the theatrical, who maintained a bitter estrangement from his mother, the Dowager Duchess, that had set tongues wagging for years, and who was rumoured to possess both a fortune vast enough to purchase half of England and a temperament cold enough to freeze the Thames in midsummer. He was said to be stern beyond measure, reclusive to the point of eccentricity, and engaged in a war of wills with his own family that had become the stuff of drawing-room. Speculation, though none could say precisely what had sparked such enduring hostility, only that it burned with an intensity that showed no signs of dimming with the passage of years. Eleanor's father, when shown the letter, had grown pale and then flushed with something that might have been hope or might have been fear, urging her to go, to discover what the Duke might want, for surely no opportunity could be dismissed when their situation had grown so desperate that the butcher had begun to refuse their credit. And so she had found herself, 3 days hence, in a hired carriage that rattled along increasingly remote country roads, watching through rain-spattered windows as the landscape transformed from the familiar gentle hills of her home county into something wilder and more dramatic, until at last the trees parted to reveal Blackwood Manor rising from the mist, like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and towering windows, its facade both magnificent and somehow forbidding, as though the house itself were taking her measure and finding her wanting. Eleanor pressed her hand against her stomach to quiet its nervous flutter, reminding herself that she had already survived the worst that fate could offer, that whatever awaited her within those imposing walls could not possibly wound her more deeply than she had already been wounded. And with that thought held firmly in her mind, like a shield against whatever was to come, she allowed the footman to hand her down from the carriage, and followed the butler's stiff-backed figure through doors that closed behind her with a sound of unmistakable finality. The study into which Eleanor was shown seemed designed to intimidate, with its towering bookshelves laden with leather-bound volumes and its massive mahogany desk positioned before windows that looked out upon grounds shrouded in mist. And yet all of these impressive details faded to insignificance the moment she beheld the man who rose from behind that desk to greet her, or rather, to assess her, for there was nothing of greeting in those cold grey eyes that swept over her person with the detached evaluation of a man examining horseflesh at market. Marcus Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, was not handsome in the way that Philip had been handsome, with his easy charm and ready smiles. The Duke's face was hewn from harder stone, all sharp angles and uncompromising lines, his dark hair swept back from a brow that seemed permanently furrowed with either displeasure or deep thought, and his tall, powerful frame carried an authority that required no announcement, no title, no introduction to make itself felt in every corner of the room. "Lady Eleanor," he said, and even his voice seemed stripped of warmth, a low baritone that conveyed neither welcome nor hostility, but something far more unsettling, complete indifference to whether she found him agreeable or terrifying. "Please sit, and I shall endeavor not to waste your time or mine with unnecessary pleasantries." She sat, her hands folded carefully in her lap to disguise their trembling, and watched as he remained standing. A deliberate choice that kept her looking up at him, kept the power firmly in his possession, and she thought that here was a man who had never in his life needed to charm anyone, who had been born to command and saw no reason to soften that command with social graces. "I require a wife," he announced without preamble, "and I have determined that you shall suit my purposes admirably." Eleanor's lips parted in surprise, but before she could voice any of the dozen questions crowding her mind, he continued in that same flat, businesslike tone. "I need an heir to secure my estate from the grasping hands of my relatives, and I need a bride who will serve as a suitable rebuke to my mother and siblings, who have made it their life's work to control me through the institution of marriage by parading an endless succession of suitable heiresses before me, like cattle at auction." He paused, and something that might have been bitter amusement flickered across his severe features. "You, Lady Eleanor, are everything they would despise, poor, touched by scandal, without powerful connections to complicate matters, and possessed of no fortune that might make them suspect me of mercenary motives." The brutal honesty of his words struck her like a physical blow, and yet beneath the sting of hearing her deficiencies catalogued so plainly, Eleanor felt an unexpected spark of something that was not quite offense. It was almost relief to hear truth spoken so boldly after months of pitying whispers and careful avoidance. "You wish to marry me to punish your family," she said slowly, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement without a trace of shame. "I wish to marry you because you are precisely what they would never choose for me, and in doing so, I remove their weapon permanently, while gaining what I require, a duchess, and eventually an heir, nothing more, with no pretense of affection, to complicate an arrangement that shall benefit us both." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment after the Duke had finished speaking, her mind turning over his proposition with the careful deliberation of one who had learned the hard way that hasty decisions, made in hope, led only to devastation, and she found herself conducting a cold accounting of her circumstances that would have seemed impossible to the romantic girl she had been mere months ago. On one side of the ledger stood continued poverty, her family's mounting debts, her father's failing health worsened by worry, and the certainty that no respectable gentleman would ever offer for a woman whose name had become a cautionary tale, whispered behind fans at every assembly. On the other side stood security, a title that would command respect regardless of how it was obtained, and a husband who promised nothing but honesty, which was perhaps more than Philip had ever truly offered beneath all his pretty words and practiced smiles. "I accept," she heard herself say, and her voice emerged steadier than she had expected, stripped of the trembling uncertainty that had plagued her since that terrible night at the Worthington ball, and something in the Duke's grey eyes flickered, surprise, perhaps, that she had not wept or protested or demanded time to consider, though he masked it quickly behind that impassive facade. The banns were read with a speed that set tongues wagging throughout the county, and when word reached the Dowager Duchess of her son's impending marriage to a penniless, scandal-touched nobody, her fury was said to have shaken the very walls of her London townhouse. She descended upon Blackwood Manor like a winter storm, all ice and cutting wind, but Marcus received her with a coldness that matched her own, and a satisfaction he did not trouble himself to conceal, informing her that the marriage would proceed with or without her blessing, and that her attendance at the ceremony was neither required nor particularly desired. Eleanor witnessed this confrontation from the doorway of the morning room, unseen by either party, and she observed how Marcus's jaw tightened with each venomous word. His mother spat about his choice of bride, how his hands clenched at his sides when the Dowager called Eleanor a fortune hunter, and worse, and she understood then that whatever his reasons for choosing her, there existed between mother and son a wound so deep and so old that her presence in this house was merely the latest weapon in a war that had been waged long before she had ever heard the name Blackwood. The wedding itself was held in the small chapel at Blackwood Manor on a morning when autumn rain streaked the stained glass windows and turned the light inside to watercolors of grey and amber, with only Eleanor's parents, a handful of servants, and the village vicar in attendance. There were no flowers beyond what the housekeeper had hastily gathered from the dying garden, no wedding breakfast planned, no guests bearing gifts and good wishes, and when Marcus slid the heavy gold band onto Eleanor's finger and spoke his vows in that low, emotionless voice, she made herself a silent promise that she would expect nothing from this union beyond what had been explicitly offered, that she would guard her heart as carefully as she would guard her new household, and that she would never again mistake practicality for passion or convenience for love, for she had learned that lesson too well to ever forget its bitter taste. The first weeks of Eleanor's new life as the Duchess of Ashworth unfolded with a strange, dreamlike quality, as though she were watching herself from a great distance, playing a role in a theatrical production for which she had never properly rehearsed, and yet the details of Blackwood Manor gradually impressed themselves upon her senses with an undeniable solidity that anchored her to this unexpected reality. The way morning light filtered through the tall windows of the East Gallery, painted golden rectangles upon the polished oak floors, the scent of beeswax and lavender that seemed to permeate every corridor, the distant chiming of the great clock in the entrance hall that marked the hours with a sonorous authority that brooked no argument. The staff had greeted her arrival with a wariness she had anticipated, their eyes carefully blank as they curtsied and bowed. Before this scandal-touched stranger, their master had inexplicably elevated to the highest position in the household, but Eleanor approached her new role with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through humiliation, learning names and duties with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed respect rather than condescension, and gradually she observed the frost in their gazes beginning to thaw into something approaching cautious approval. Her interactions with Marcus himself remained formal to the point of stiffness, their paths crossing primarily at dinner, where conversation adhered to the safely impersonal topics of estate management and household matters, his grey eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts as he sat at the head of the impossibly long table while she occupied the foot like a distant island barely visible on the horizon. And yet Eleanor began to notice small things that did not quite align with the portrait of cold indifference he had painted of their arrangement when she shivered one evening as a draught crept through the dining room. New heavy curtains appeared at the windows within the week without any word of explanation. When she mentioned in passing to the housekeeper that she had always been fond of a particular blend of tea from her childhood, that very tea materialized in her sitting room the following morning, as though it had always been there. When she admired a volume of poetry in the library, but returned it to its shelf thinking herself unobserved, she found it waiting on her bedside table that night with a ribbon marking the page she had been reading. These small attentions, never acknowledged and never explained, began to trouble the carefully constructed walls Eleanor had built around her heart, for they suggested a man who noticed far more than his stern countenance would indicate, a man who perhaps listened when he appeared most distant, and she found herself lying awake in her grand bedchamber with its silk hangings and crackling fire, staring at the canopy above her head and wondering who Marcus Blackwood truly was beneath that impenetrable armor of coldness. Whether the man who had proposed marriage as a weapon against his family was the same man who ensured her favorite flowers appeared in her rooms, and what it might mean if he were not. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor first discovered that the library at Blackwood Manor became an entirely different place after the household had retired. The great room transformed by the dying embers of the fire and the soft glow of a single candelabra into something intimate and almost enchanted, and she had taken to stealing down in her dressing gown when sleep eluded her, finding solace among the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling like silent sentinels guarding centuries of accumulated wisdom. She had not expected to find Marcus there on that particular evening, seated in a wing-back chair near the hearth, with a glass of brandy cradled in his long fingers and his cravat loosened in a way she had never seen during their formal daytime encounters, and for a moment they simply stared at one another across the shadowed expanse of Persian carpet, two people caught in the unexpected intimacy of the late hour. "I could not sleep," Eleanor offered by way of explanation, prepared to retreat, but Marcus gestured toward the chair opposite his with a movement that seemed almost involuntary, as though his body had made the invitation before his mind could construct its usual barriers, and she found herself settling into the worn leather while the fire crackled softly between them, and the great clock in the hall marked the passage of time with its steady, unhurried rhythm. The conversation began haltingly, circling around safe harbors of books and weather, But somewhere in the small hours, it drifted into deeper waters, and Eleanor listened as Marcus spoke of a childhood spent in this very house under the glacial scrutiny of a mother who viewed her children as chess pieces to be strategically deployed rather than souls to be nurtured, of a father whose disappointment had been a living thing that poisoned every interaction until his death 3 years prior, of siblings who appeared at his door only when their creditors grew too insistent to ignore. His voice remained steady throughout, that familiar controlled tone. But Eleanor heard the old wounds bleeding beneath each carefully chosen word, and something in her chest ached with recognition. "My father wept when Philip ended our engagement," she heard herself confessing in return, the words emerging before she could stop them. "Not for my heartbreak, but because he had been counting on Philip's fortune to save our estate, and I realized then that I had been a transaction that failed to complete, a bill of goods returned as unsatisfactory, and I have wondered since whether anyone has ever wanted me for myself alone, rather than for what I might provide them." The silence that followed her admission stretched taut as a bowstring, and when Eleanor finally raised her eyes to meet Marcus's gaze, she found something there she had not seen before, not pity, which she could not have borne, but a kind of fierce understanding that seemed to bridge the careful distance they had maintained since their wedding day. And when his hand moved across the space between their chairs to cover hers where it rested on the armrest, the warmth of his touch sent a shock through her entire body that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying awareness that this man she had married for practical reasons was becoming something far more dangerous to the heart she had sworn to protect. The Dowager Duchess arrived at Blackwood Manor on a grey afternoon, when the clouds hung low and heavy with the threat of rain, her black, lacquered carriage sweeping up the gravel drive, with all the ominous portent of a storm front moving across the moors. And Eleanor, who had been informed of the impending visit only that morning by a tight-lipped Mrs. Hartley, felt her stomach clench with apprehension as she watched from the drawing-room window while footmen scrambled to attend the formidable figure, emerging from the carriage in a swirl of dark violet silk and an expression that could have curdled fresh cream. The dowager was a tall woman who carried her years like weapons, her silver hair swept up in an elaborate style that spoke of hours at her toilette, her pale eyes so like Marcus's and yet so utterly different in their calculating coldness, sweeping over Eleanor with the sort of assessment one might give livestock at market before finding it wanting. "So this is the creature my son has inflicted upon our family name," the dowager pronounced before Eleanor could complete her curtsy, the words falling into the drawing-room like stones dropped into still water, and Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of blood rushing to her cheeks, even as she straightened her spine and met that frigid gaze with what composure she could summon. What followed was an exercise in refined cruelty that would have impressed the most accomplished torturers of history, the dowager's observations delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Remarks about Eleanor's unfashionable gown, her lack of proper connections, the scandal that clung to her name like perfume applied too liberally, the transparent desperation that must have driven her to accept such an arrangement with a man who had clearly chosen her as an instrument of revenge rather than a wife worthy of the Blackwood legacy. "One can hardly blame Philip Mercer for seeking greener pastures," the dowager mused, examining her gloved fingers as though the conversation bored her. "When faced with such limited prospects, though I confess surprise that even my son's spite would drive him to such depths as to marry a woman whose own betrothed found her so thoroughly disposable." Eleanor's hands trembled where they were clasped in her lap, but she could not give this woman the satisfaction of tears, and she was drawing breath to deliver what calm response she could formulate, when the drawing-room door opened with such force that it struck the wall behind it, and Marcus stood in the doorway with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face before, a cold fury so intense that even the dowager's composure flickered for a moment, like a candle caught in a sudden draught. "You will leave this house within the hour," Marcus said, his voice quiet and yet somehow more terrible for its restraint, "and you will never speak to my wife in such a manner again, or I will ensure that every door in society closes to you, every comfort you currently enjoy disappears, and you spend your remaining years discovering precisely how little the Blackwood name protects those who are no longer welcome to use it." The dowager's departure was swift and silent, and when Eleanor finally looked up at Marcus, still standing in the doorway with his hands clenched at his sides, She found she could not speak past the tightness in her throat, not from the dowager's cruelty, but from the bewildering, terrifying realization that this man who had married her as a weapon had just wielded himself as her shield. The days that followed the dowager's departure unfolded with a quietness that felt almost sacred, as though the great house itself had drawn a breath of relief and now exhaled slowly into a new kind of peace, and it was within this gentler atmosphere that Eleanor began to notice the accumulation of small gestures that, taken individually, might have meant nothing at all, but gathered together like wildflowers, pressed between the pages of a book, began to form a picture she was almost afraid to examine too closely. A volume of poetry appeared on her bedside table one morning, its leather cover soft with age, and its pages marked at verses she had mentioned admiring weeks ago during one of their increasingly frequent evening conversations, and when she inquired with Mrs. Hartley about its origin, the housekeeper's knowing smile told her everything the woman's discreet words did not. There were walks through the grounds that became a daily ritual, Marcus adjusting his long stride to match hers as they wandered through the awakening gardens, where crocuses pushed their brave heads through the last of the winter frost, and when Eleanor stumbled on an uneven patch of ground near the old folly, his hand shot out to steady her elbow with a swiftness that spoke of attention closely paid, and he did not release her immediately, but kept his fingers there, warm even through the layers of her pelisse and gown, as though he had forgotten the gesture was meant to be temporary. The servants whispered among themselves when they thought neither the Duke nor Duchess could hear, Eleanor catching fragments of conversation that painted a picture of transformation, how His Grace had been seen smiling, actually smiling, in the east corridor, how he had inquired after the head gardener's ailing wife and sent the village physician without being asked, how he lingered now at the breakfast table instead of retreating immediately to his study, his eyes following the Duchess with an expression that old Mrs. Hartley, who had served 3 generations of Blackwoods, declared she had never witnessed on any face in this house before. Eleanor felt her heart beginning to betray her with each passing day, the careful walls she had constructed around it, developing cracks through which dangerous tendrils of hope were beginning to grow, and she found herself lying awake at night, not from sorrow as she once had, but from the terrifying sweetness of anticipation, wondering what the next day might bring, what expression might cross his severe features when she entered a room, what accidental brush of fingers might occur and linger just a moment longer than necessity demanded, and in the privacy of her chamber, with moonlight streaming through the window and the great house settling into sleep around her, Eleanor pressed her hands to her face and acknowledged the truth she could no longer deny. That gratitude had somehow transformed into something far more perilous, and the husband she had married expecting nothing had become the man from whom she now wanted everything. The invitation to the Countess of Hartwell's spring ball arrived on a silver tray one morning in late April, its heavy cream paper embossed with elegant script that seemed to Eleanor to carry the weight of 1,000 whispered judgments, and she found her hands trembling slightly as she set it down upon the breakfast table, for this would be her first true appearance before the society that had witnessed her greatest humiliation, the same glittering assembly of lords and ladies who had observed her devastation at Philip Mercer's hands and then feasted upon the scandal like vultures upon carrion. Marcus, seated across from her with his coffee growing cold and forgotten, studied her face with that penetrating gaze she had come to know so well, the one that seemed to see past every careful mask she had ever constructed, and after a long moment he said simply, "We shall attend, and you shall outshine every woman present," with such quiet certainty that Eleanor almost believed him. The days before the ball passed in a flurry of preparations that Eleanor found both terrifying and oddly thrilling, seamstresses arriving from London with fabrics and fashion plates, Mrs. Hartley overseeing fittings with military precision, and through it all Marcus remained a steady presence, appearing at unexpected moments to inquire after her comfort or offer opinions on colors and styles, with a knowledge that surprised her until she realized he had been paying attention to her preferences all along. On the evening of the ball, Eleanor stood before her mirror in a gown of deep sapphire silk that seemed to have been designed to complement her complexion perfectly. Her hair dressed elegantly by the skilled lady's maid Marcus had engaged for her, and she was attempting to steady her breathing when a knock sounded at her chamber door, and Marcus entered carrying a velvet case that he set upon her dressing table without ceremony. "These are not Blackwood jewels," he said as he opened the case to reveal a set of emeralds so brilliant They seemed to contain captured firelight within their depths, a necklace and matching earrings that took Eleanor's breath away with their beauty. I had them commissioned for you specifically, because you deserve adornments that carry no history but the one we create together, no expectations but those we choose, no weight of disapproving ancestors or bitter memories. Eleanor could not speak past the tightness in her throat as Marcus himself fastened the necklace around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin with a tenderness that made her shiver. And when she met his eyes in the mirror, she saw something there that looked almost like wonder, as though he was seeing her for the first time, even as she felt herself being truly seen for the first time in her life. Their entrance into the Countess of Hartwell's ballroom was everything Eleanor had feared, and nothing she had expected. The sudden hush, as the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth were announced, the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward them, but where she had anticipated condemnation, she found instead a wave of something that took her several moments to identify as envy, the gathered tongue taking in her transformed appearance and her husband's unmistakable attentiveness, and Eleanor realized with a start that the whispers surrounding her now were not of scandal, but of speculation about how the discarded fiancé had risen so magnificently from the ashes of her disgrace. The ballroom had transformed from a place of triumph to one of sudden tension in the space of a single heartbeat, for Eleanor had scarcely finished accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman when she became aware of a figure approaching through the crowd with the particular deliberation of a predator who has spotted wounded prey, and when she turned to face the newcomer, her blood ran cold at the sight of Lord Philip Mercer, standing before her with that same charming smile she had once found so captivating, but which now seemed to her nothing more than a mask, stretched over emptiness. "Your Grace," he said, the title dripping from his lips with barely concealed mockery, as he executed a bow that managed to convey contempt rather than respect. "How remarkably you have risen in the world since last we met, though I confess I had not expected to see the discarded daughter of a bankrupt viscount playing Duchess quite so convincingly." Eleanor felt the words land like blows against the armor she had so carefully constructed, each syllable designed to remind her of her origins and the humiliation he had so publicly inflicted upon her, and she opened her mouth to deliver a response that would preserve her dignity while refusing to descend to his level. But before any sound could emerge, she became aware of a presence at her shoulder, a familiar warmth and the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely Marcus that she had come to know so well over these past months. "Lord Mercer," Marcus said, and though his voice remained perfectly level, almost conversational in its tone, Eleanor could feel the danger radiating from him like heat from a forge, could see the way nearby guests fell silent and turned to watch, with the particular avidity of those who sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. "I find myself curious about the nature of this conversation you appear to be having with my wife." Philip's smile flickered almost imperceptibly before he recovered his composure and offered another shallow bow. "Your Grace, I was merely renewing an old acquaintance and offering my congratulations on your recent marriage, though one cannot help but observe that the circumstances of the match seem rather convenient for all parties involved." The silence that fell over the surrounding crowd was absolute, and Eleanor watched as Marcus took a single step forward, closing the distance between himself and Philip until they stood mere inches apart. And when he spoke again, his voice carried with crystalline clarity to every straining ear in the vicinity. "Let me ensure I understand you correctly, you who publicly discarded a woman of intelligence, grace, and genuine worth in exchange for a fortune attached to a bride whose family was desperate enough to overlook your gambling debts and questionable associations, presume to question the circumstances of my marriage to the finest woman in this room." Philip's face drained of color as whispers erupted throughout the ballroom like flames catching dry kindling, and Eleanor understood in that moment that Marcus had just revealed secrets Philip had clearly believed well hidden, and she watched as her former betrothed attempted to stammer some response only to be cut off by Marcus's continued assault, delivered in that same terrifyingly calm tone. "You were not worthy to speak her name then, Mercer, and you are certainly not worthy to speak it now. And if I ever again hear of you approaching my wife or speaking of her with anything less than the utmost respect, you will discover precisely how unpleasant it can be to draw the attention of a man who has both the resources and the inclination to destroy you utterly." Philip retreated without another word, his face burning with humiliation as the assembled guests parted before him like water before a stone, and Eleanor found herself trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming force of emotion that crashed through her as Marcus turned to face her, his expression softening in a way that made her heart stutter in her chest, and she realized that whatever this arrangement had been at its beginning, it had become something else entirely. The carriage that bore them away from the Countess of Hartwell's residence seemed to Eleanor to exist in some separate realm from the glittering ballroom they had just departed, a velvet-lined cocoon of shadows and silence, where the clatter of hooves upon cobblestones served only to emphasize the weight of everything that remained unspoken between them, and she found herself acutely aware of Marcus's presence on the seat across from her, his face half illuminated by the flickering light of passing street lamps, his expression unreadable, yet somehow more open than she had ever witnessed it before. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice emerging smaller than she had intended, "for what you did in there, for defending me against Philip. You did not have to expose yourself to such scrutiny or risk your reputation by engaging with him so publicly." Marcus shifted slightly, and when he spoke his tone carried that familiar dismissive quality that she had come to recognize as his first line of defense against any acknowledgement of his own kindness. "I merely protected what is mine, Your Grace," as any husband would do when confronted with an insect presuming to approach his wife. But even as the words left his lips, Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes, something that contradicted the cold practicality of his statement, and she understood with a sudden clarity that pierced through all her carefully maintained defenses that Marcus Blackwood was far more skilled at hiding his heart than she had ever been at hiding hers. The remainder of the journey passed in a silence that hummed with tension of an entirely different nature than any Eleanor had experienced before, and when they arrived at Blackwood Manor, and Marcus handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered upon hers for a moment longer than necessity required, sending a cascade of warmth through her entire being. They walked together through the grand entrance hall, their footsteps echoing in the late-night stillness, and when they reached the point where their paths would diverge toward their separate chambers, Eleanor found herself turning to face him, some desperate need to understand what was happening between them, overriding her usual caution, and she discovered that he had stopped as well, standing so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the subtle quickening of his breath. "Eleanor," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, stripped of title or formality, seemed to unlock something within her chest that she had kept carefully sealed since the night Philip Mercer had taught her the cost of hoping. Marcus raised one hand as if to touch her face, his fingers hovering mere inches from her cheek, and Eleanor felt herself swaying toward him like a flower toward sunlight, her lips parting in anticipation of something she had forbidden herself to want, when the sound of a door closing somewhere in the servants' quarters shattered the moment like glass, and Marcus stepped back with an abruptness that left her feeling bereft in ways she could not name. "Good night, Your Grace," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been frustration or might have been longing, and then he was gone, striding away toward his chambers with a speed that seemed almost like flight, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the corridor with her heart pounding against her ribs and her mind racing through every possible interpretation of what had almost occurred. Sleep eluded her entirely that night, her thoughts circling endlessly around the memory of his eyes in the ballroom, the protective fury in his voice, the way his hand had trembled almost imperceptibly as it hovered near her face, and she found herself suspended between the familiar safety of expecting nothing and the terrifying possibility that perhaps, against all reason and experience, she had found something worth hoping for after all. The days that followed the ball seemed to Eleanor to exist in a state of suspended enchantment, as though the near kiss in the corridor had shifted something fundamental in the architecture of their arrangement, transforming the careful distances they had maintained into something altogether more dangerous and infinitely more precious, and she found herself counting the hours between their encounters with an eagerness that would have alarmed her former self, the self who had sworn never again to risk the devastation of disappointed hope. Breakfast became a ritual she anticipated with secret pleasure, watching Marcus across the table as morning light streamed through the tall windows of the dining room, noting the way his severe features softened almost imperceptibly when their eyes met, the way his questions about her plans for the day carried an undertone of genuine interest that made her pulse quicken in a manner most unbecoming for a duchess. It was during one such breakfast that Marcus announced his intention to teach her to ride his favorite horse, a magnificent black stallion named Prometheus, whom the stable hands approached with respectful caution, and Eleanor's initial protests about her limited equestrian experience dissolved in the face of his quiet insistence that he would permit nothing to harm her, a statement delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that she found herself agreeing before her sensible mind could intervene. The riding lessons became the sweetest torture Eleanor had ever known, for they required Marcus to stand close beside her, his hands guiding her grip on the reins, his breath warm against her ear as he murmured instructions, and more than once she felt the strength of his arms steadying her when Prometheus shifted unexpectedly, holding her against his chest for moments that stretched into small eternities before propriety forced them apart. She repaid his patience in the only currency she possessed, teaching him to find joy in the simple pleasures he had long denied himself, coaxing him to walk with her through the kitchen gardens where she pointed out the herbs that would flavor their evening meals, convincing him to sit beside her on a blanket beneath the old oak tree, where she read aloud from novels he pretended to find frivolous, but listened to with an attention that belied his dismissive words, and one afternoon she drew from him something she had begun to believe impossible: laughter, genuine and unguarded, at her deliberately terrible impression of the Dowager Duchess, a sound so unexpected and so beautiful that Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes even as she laughed alongside him. The household staff observed these changes with the particular satisfaction of servants who have long wished for their master's happiness, and Mrs. Pemberton was heard to remark to the butler that she had served 3 generations of Blackwoods but had never seen the manor feel so much like a home, while the young housemaids exchanged knowing glances whenever the Duke and Duchess emerged from the library with flushed cheeks and suspiciously bright eyes, and even the stern-faced head groom permitted himself a small smile when His Grace requested a gentle mare be saddled alongside Prometheus so that Her Grace might accompany him on his morning rides. Eleanor felt herself blooming under the warmth of Marcus's attention, like a flower too long kept in shadow, finally reaching toward the sun. Yet even as happiness suffused her days, she could not entirely silence the whisper of fear that reminded her how quickly such joy could be snatched away. The evening had settled over Blackwood Manor like a soft velvet cloak, the last rays of sunlight painting the western sky in shades of rose and amber that seemed to Eleanor almost unbearably beautiful in their transience, and she had sought refuge in the walled garden where climbing roses cascaded over ancient stone and the scent of lavender hung heavy in the cooling air. Needing desperately to be alone with thoughts that had grown too large and too frightening to contain within the confines of the house where Marcus's presence seemed to permeate every room and corridor, she stood beside the old sundial at the garden's center, her fingers tracing the worn Latin inscription that spoke of time's passage, and she did not hear his approaching footsteps until his voice, low and tinged with concern, broke through the twilight stillness. "I have been searching for you for nearly an hour, Eleanor. The servant said you had gone walking, but none could say where, and I confess I found myself growing rather more anxious than the situation perhaps warranted." She turned to face him, and something in her expression must have betrayed the turmoil within her heart, for Marcus's brow furrowed and he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes catching the dying light. "What troubles you so deeply that you would hide yourself away from me? Have I done something to cause you distress?" The question, asked with such genuine bewilderment, such obvious inability to comprehend that he himself was the source of her anguish, broke something loose within Eleanor's chest, and she heard herself speaking before wisdom could intervene, her voice emerging raw and unsteady in a way she had not permitted since the night of her public humiliation. "I find myself in an impossible position, Your Grace, one I never anticipated when I accepted your practical arrangement, for I have committed the unforgivable foolishness of developing feelings for you, feelings that extend far beyond gratitude or companionship, or any of the safe emotions I had permitted myself to expect." She watched his face for any reaction, saw the slight parting of his lips, the almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, and pressed on before courage could desert her entirely. "I am falling in love with you, Marcus, and the terror of that admission threatens to undo me completely, because I cannot bear to discover that while I have been building castles of hope in my foolish heart, You have remained precisely where you began, viewing me as nothing more than a convenient means to thwart your family and secure your heir, and I would rather know the truth now, however painful, than continue living in this suspended state between hope and despair that has become its own particular form of torture." Her voice broke on the final word, and she felt the hot sting of tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, tears she had sworn she would never again shed over a man, and the silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch into an eternity, the garden holding its breath alongside her as she awaited a response that would either shatter her heart completely or offer salvation beyond her most secret dreams. The silence that followed Eleanor's confession stretched between them like a living thing, fragile and trembling, and she watched Marcus's face as emotions she had never before witnessed flickered across those stern features, his jaw tightening and then releasing, his hands clenching at his sides as though he were fighting some internal battle whose outcome remained desperately uncertain. And when at last he spoke, his voice emerged rough and halting in a manner so unlike his usual measured tones that Eleanor felt her heart stutter within her chest. "I find myself in the unenviable position of needing to say things I have never learned how to say, words that have never been spoken in the house where I was raised, where affection was treated as weakness and sentiment as foolishness to be stamped out before it could take root." He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse beating at his throat, could smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that had come to mean safety and home, and his hand rose as though of its own accord to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "You speak of being merely convenient, of serving as a means to an end. But Eleanor, I must confess something that I have kept hidden even from myself until this very moment, for I did not choose you simply to spite my family, though I allowed myself to believe that comfortable lie because the truth was far more terrifying." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, catching a tear she had not realized had escaped, and his grey eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to pierce through every defense she had ever constructed. "I saw you before Philip Mercer's cruelty exposed him for the fool he was. Saw you at the Harrington Musicale 3 seasons past when you noticed a young serving girl struggling with a heavy tray and moved to help her without thought for propriety or the whispers it might cause. And I watched you again at Lady Pemberton's garden party when you sat with the elderly Countess of Whitmore for an entire afternoon, simply because she was lonely and no one else would spare her their time, and I knew then that you possessed something I had never encountered in all my years among the ton, genuine goodness unmarred by calculation." His voice grew rougher still, cracking on words that seemed to cost him dearly to speak. "When I learned of your broken engagement, of how that worthless creature had humiliated you, I told myself my interest was purely practical, that you would serve my purposes admirably, but I was lying to myself because the truth, Eleanor, the truth that I can no longer deny, is that I cannot imagine drawing breath in a world where you are not beside me, that your laughter has become necessary to me as sunlight, that the thought of any harm befalling you fills me with a rage that frightens me with its intensity, and if that is not love, then I do not know what name to give it." Before she could respond, before words could prove inadequate to the enormity of the moment, Marcus lowered his mouth to hers and kissed her with all the desperate tenderness of a man who had believed himself incapable of such feeling, and Eleanor melted into him completely, her hands fisting in the lapels of his coat as years of carefully maintained walls crumbled into dust around them both. They walked from the garden as though in a dream, hands intertwined with fingers laced together in a manner that spoke of claiming and belonging, and Eleanor felt as though every nerve in her body had been awakened to sensation she had never before experienced, the warmth of Marcus's palm against hers sending tremors of anticipation through her entire being as they moved through the corridors of Blackwood Manor that had become her home, yet now seemed transformed into something entirely new, charged with possibility and promise. When they reached the door to her chambers, Marcus paused, and she saw in his eyes a question that held no presumption, only hope, tempered by the patience of a man who had waited so long already and would wait longer still if she required it. But Eleanor found that waiting was the last thing she desired, that the walls she had built around her heart had crumbled so completely that she wanted nothing more than to be known by him, in every way a wife could be known by a husband, and so she answered his unspoken question by rising on her toes to press her lips to his once more, a kiss that began tender but deepened into something urgent and seeking. He drew her into the room and closed the door behind them, and in the candlelight his hands found the fastenings of her gown with a reverence that made her eyes sting with unshed tears, each touch a wordless declaration as the silk pooled at her feet, and he looked upon her as though she were something precious beyond measure. And when she reached to unfasten his cravat, her fingers trembled not with fear, but with the overwhelming emotion of finally being truly seen. They came together with a passion made more intense by the tenderness that underscored every caress, every whispered endearment, every moment where eyes met and held as bodies learned the language of one another, and Eleanor discovered that the cold Duke, who had proposed a marriage of convenience, was capable of such gentle ferocity that she felt herself remade in his arms, her past hurts dissolving like morning mist beneath the warmth of his devoted attention. Afterward they lay tangled together in the rumpled linens, her head upon his chest where she could hear the gradually slowing rhythm of his heart, and Marcus's fingers traced lazy patterns upon her bare shoulder as he pressed kisses to her hair and spoke words he had never spoken to any living soul, words of how empty his life had been before her, how she had brought color to a world he had believed forever gray. When morning light crept through the curtains to find them still wrapped in one another's embrace, Eleanor woke to discover Marcus watching her with an expression of such unguarded adoration that she felt her heart might burst with the fullness of it, and as he drew her close once more and murmured against her lips that he intended to spend every morning for the rest of his life waking exactly thus, she knew with absolute certainty that their bond had been sealed in every way that mattered, that what had begun as a practical arrangement had transformed into a partnership of souls, and that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together as true husband and wife at last. The season's grandest ball arrived some weeks hence, hosted by the Marchioness of Thornbury in her magnificent London residence, and Eleanor entered upon Marcus's arm wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented the emeralds at her throat, feeling for the first time in her life not merely accepted by society but genuinely celebrated, for the whispers that followed her now carried an entirely different tenor than those which had haunted her after Philip's cruel rejection. These new murmurs, speaking of how radiant the Duchess of Ashworth appeared, how obviously devoted her stern husband was to her comfort, how the cold Duke seemed transformed into something almost warm when his gaze fell upon his wife. She moved through the glittering assembly with a grace born not of performance but of genuine contentment, accepting congratulations and compliments with the quiet dignity that had always been her nature, and Marcus remained ever at her side or within sight, his grey eyes finding hers across crowded rooms with a look of such tender possession that Eleanor felt her cheeks warm each time their gazes met. It was near the supper hour when she noticed Lord Philip Mercer standing rigid beside a pillar, his face bearing the pinched expression of a man who has swallowed something exceedingly bitter, and at his side stood his wealthy bride, Lady Honoria Mercer née Blackstone, whose sharp features were twisted into a sneer as she berated him in tones just barely quiet enough to maintain the pretense of privacy, her words carrying none the less to nearby ears as she complained about the inadequacy of his quarterly allowance and the embarrassment of his family connections. Eleanor observed how Philip's shoulders hunched beneath his wife's assault, how the charming confidence that had once dazzled her had curdled into something desperate and diminished, and when his eyes lifted and found Eleanor watching, she saw in them a flash of such naked envy and regret that she might once have felt vindicated, might once have savoured the reversal of their fortunes, yet she discovered within herself only a distant pity for a man who had chosen wealth over worth and found himself impoverished in every way that truly mattered. The Dowager Duchess was notably absent from the evening's festivities, and Eleanor overheard Lady Pemberton confiding to Mrs. Ashford Wells that the formidable old dragon had retreated entirely to the Dower House following her son's very public devotion to his wife, her schemes to control the dukedom through a more pliable bride, thoroughly defeated by the genuine love match that had flourished in defiance of her machinations. As the orchestra struck up a waltz, Marcus appeared at Eleanor's elbow and drew her onto the floor without asking, holding her closer than strict propriety might dictate, while society looked on with knowing smiles, and Eleanor realized with a swelling heart that she had become not the scandalous convenience the ton had expected, but something far more powerful, a woman so thoroughly loved by one of England's most formidable men that even the highest sticklers of society could only offer their grudging admiration and their genuine respect. 2 years had passed since that transformative night in the garden, when two wounded souls had finally found the courage to speak their hearts, and Blackwood Manor had undergone a metamorphosis as profound as the love that now flourished within its ancient walls. For where once the great house had stood cold and forbidding beneath grey English skies, it now seemed to radiate warmth from every window, every carefully tended flower bed, every corner where laughter had replaced the oppressive silence that had reigned during the years of Marcus's solitary occupation. Eleanor moved through the sun-dappled corridors, with one hand pressed to the considerable swell of her belly. Her condition, now advanced enough that the physician had gently suggested she limit her activities, though she found it impossible to remain idle when there was so much happiness to be savoured in each passing day, and before she had taken 3 steps Marcus appeared at her side, as though summoned by some invisible thread that connected them always, his hand finding the small of her back with the easy familiarity of a man who could no longer bear to be in a room without touching his wife in some small way. The nursery preparations had consumed much of their attention these past months, and Eleanor had delighted in selecting fabrics and furnishings that would welcome their child into a home filled with love rather than the cold duty that had characterized Marcus's own upbringing, and she had watched with quietly overflowing heart as her husband had personally overseen the installation of a rocking chair by the window, positioning it precisely where the morning light would fall most gently upon mother and babe. Their private moments had only deepened in intimacy as the months progressed, filled with whispered conversations in the darkness about hopes and fears for the tiny life growing within her, with Marcus's large hands spread reverently across her belly to feel their child's movements, with private jokes that had developed their own language, requiring no words, merely a glance across a crowded room or a slight quirk of lips that spoke volumes only they could read. The household staff moved through their duties with the quiet contentment of servants who genuinely loved their master and mistress, Mrs. Hartley often remarking to cook that she had served 3 generations of Blackwoods and never seen the manor so alive with genuine happiness, while the tenants on the estate spoke in the village of the Duchess's kindness in visiting the sick and the Duke's fairness in matters of rent and repair, their benevolent care transforming lands that had long suffered under negligent stewardship into prospering farms and comfortable cottages. Eleanor sometimes paused in her wanderings through the house she had come to love so deeply, her hand resting upon her swollen middle as she contemplated the extraordinary journey that had brought her from public humiliation to this place of such complete contentment. And in those moments, Marcus would inevitably appear, drawing her into his arms with the tender attentiveness that had never diminished since the night he had first confessed his heart, pressing his lips to her temple and murmuring that she had given him everything he had never dared hope to possess. The birth of their son came on a morning gilded with autumn sunshine, the leaves of the great oaks surrounding Blackwood Manor blazing in shades of amber and gold, as though nature itself had chosen to celebrate the arrival of the heir to the dukedom, and Eleanor laboured through the long hours of the night with Marcus refusing to leave her side, despite the protestations of the physician and the midwife, who insisted that such matters were not appropriate for a gentleman's presence, but the Duke of Ashworth had merely fixed them with that cold grey stare that brooked no argument and stated flatly that he would not leave his wife, and so he remained, holding her hand through every wave of pain, pressing cool cloths to her brow, murmuring words of encouragement that Eleanor would later remember as the anchor that kept her tethered to hope when her strength threatened to falter. When at last the babe's cry pierced the chamber, strong and indignant and gloriously alive, Eleanor watched through tears of exhaustion and joy as the midwife placed their son in Marcus's arms, and what she witnessed in that moment she knew she would carry in her heart until her final breath, for the stern Duke of Ashworth, the man society had called cold and unfeeling, stood trembling with his newborn child, cradled against his chest while tears streamed openly down his face, his voice breaking as he whispered to the tiny bundle that he was loved beyond measure and would never know the coldness that had marked his father's own childhood. They named him Edward Marcus Blackwood, and he grew into a spirited boy with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn chin, followed 2 years later by a daughter they called Catherine, a dark-haired sprite whose laughter seemed to fill every corner of the great manor with music. Eleanor often paused in her duties as Duchess to simply watch her family, her heart so full it seemed impossible that it had once been shattered beyond repair, Observing Marcus on his hands and knees in the nursery, letting Edward ride upon his back like a horse, while Catherine shrieked with delight and demanded her turn, or finding her husband in the library with both children on his lap as he read to them with different voices for each character, his severe features soft with a contentment she knew mirrored her own. The household staff remarked frequently upon the transformation of their master, Mrs. Hartley, confiding to Eleanor one afternoon that she had served the Blackwood family for 30 years and never once seen such happiness within these walls, and Eleanor had simply smiled and squeezed the housekeeper's hand, understanding that the love she and Marcus had built together had not merely changed their own lives, but had rippled outward to touch everyone within their care. On quiet evenings, after the children had been tucked into their beds and the house had settled into peaceful silence, Eleanor and Marcus would sit together before the fire in their private chambers, her head resting upon his shoulder and his arm wrapped securely around her waist, speaking of small matters and large dreams. And in those moments, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity that the love between them had not diminished with time and familiarity, but had instead grown deeper and stronger, rooted now not only in passion but in partnership, in shared purpose, in the daily choice to cherish one another through all of life's seasons. Eleanor often found herself in quiet moments of reflection as the years continued to unfold, their blessings upon Blackwood Manor, pausing in the midst of ordinary days to marvel at the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone since that devastating evening when Lord Philip Mercer had shattered her heart before the assembled scrutiny of society, and she understood now, with the wisdom that only time and experience could bestow, that the humiliation she had once believed would define her forever had instead become merely the dark prologue to a story more beautiful than any she could have imagined in those bleak months of shame and despair. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing more than security and a roof over her head, had steeled herself against hope as one might armor against inevitable disappointment, and yet here she stood years later as the beloved wife of a man whose very name had once inspired whispers of coldness and severity, as the mother of children whose laughter rang through halls that had known only silence, as a woman who had discovered that the greatest loves were not those born of instant passion and romantic declaration, but rather those cultivated slowly through countless small choices, through daily kindnesses, through the steady accumulation of trust and respect that formed foundations far stronger than any fleeting infatuation could provide. Marcus had taught her through his actions rather than his words that love was not merely spoken but demonstrated in the remembering of small preferences and the fierce protection of one's beloved and the tender vulnerability of allowing another person to witness one's deepest fears and most carefully guarded wounds, and she had taught him in turn that joy could be found in simple pleasures and that the coldness he had worn as armor could be shed safely in the presence of one who would never use his softness against him. And together they had built something neither had dared believe possible when they had stood as strangers in his study while he proposed an arrangement of pure convenience. The woman who had once been pitied throughout the ton as the cast-off bride of a fortune hunter now presided over one of England's great houses with confidence and grace, her happiness so evident that even the most determined gossips had long since abandoned their whispered speculations about the peculiar match. And if she occasionally glimpsed Lord Philip at society events, looking pinched and miserable beside his wealthy but perpetually dissatisfied wife, she felt nothing but a distant compassion for the shallow young man who had inadvertently set her upon the path to everything she now cherished. To you who have journeyed alongside Eleanor through her darkest hours and her brightest triumphs, who have witnessed the slow unfurling of a love that neither party expected nor initially sought, she offers her deepest gratitude for your companionship and her fervent hope that such happiness awaits all who remain open to finding love in unexpected places, for she has learned that the heart's greatest weakness, the vulnerability of loving and being loved in return, is in truth its greatest strength, and that sometimes the arrangements we accept out of mere practicality become the vessels through which our most profound blessings are delivered.